This video is brought to you by NordVPN. Give yourself options online. Go to nordvpn.com/biographics to get a 2-year plan with a huge discount, plus 4 additional months for free. More on them in a bit. Try and picture the stereotype of a 20th century Latin American dictator. What do you see? We're guessing it involves absurd military uniforms, callous disregard for human life, and an ego so big it could be seen from space. Now take all of those qualities and dial them up, inflating each one until it becomes just a mere caricature, a cartoon villain of a human being. Well, congratulations, you're now about halfway to imagining the absurd, bloodthirsty tyrant who was Rafael Trujillo. Absolute ruler of the Dominican Republic from 1930 to 1961, Trujillo was the prototypical Latin American caudillo. Vain, pompous, and unbelievably sadistic. Under his watch, the entire population was subject to arbitrary detention, torture, and murder, all while blazing neon signs proliferated, beaming his name into the Caribbean night. Yet, it wasn't just his vice-like grip on his own nation that kept Trujillo in power. Hailed as a reformer and ally by the US, Trujillo enjoyed access to senators and presidents even as his regime conducted racial massacres and plotted the assassination of world leaders. Today, Biographics is delving into the life of one of the bloodiest dictators in Latin American history. In the dark days of the Trillato, there were certain things that no one in the Dominican Republic could say out loud. Much of it was standard dictator stuff, criticizing the regime, whispering aloud the tyrant's mocking nickname of the Goat. But some of it was stranger, more personal. For instance, there was an official version of Rafael Trujillo's background, one that got taught in schools, one that covered his aristocratic European ancestors in minute detail. But woe betide anyone who dared go beyond that to whisper the truth. During the regime, there was no quicker way to get yourself murdered than by openly discussing the Goat's working-class, non-white roots. Born Rafael Leonidas Trujillo Molina, the future dictator first opened his eyes on the 24th of October 1891 in a village on the southern coast. The third of a staggering 11 children, Trujillo entered a family that wasn't just blue-collar, but actively poor. To supplement his income, the boy's dad would rustle cattle. Rather than go to school, Trujillo was sporadically educated by willing neighbors. But while his unglamorous origins would cause him shame in later life, they would have nothing on his ancestry. Trujillo's mother, you see, was half black, the product of a union between a Dominican and a Haitian. And in that place, in that era, nothing could be a source of greater humiliation. The only two nations sharing the island of Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic and Haiti, have long defined themselves in opposition to the other. Founded by a successful slave rebellion, Haiti was defiantly black and Caribbean, a nation where French Creole was the lingua franca. Trujillo's side of the islands, by contrast, was Spanish-speaking and firmly orientated towards Europe. Ever since a bitter 2-decade occupation by Haitian forces ended in 1844, Dominicans had grown to see their neighbors not just as different, but as alien savages. Hence the lifelong horror Trujillo would feel at his own Haitian roots, hence his desperate need as an adult to use makeup to lighten his skin tone. By the time he finally reached power, the Goat would be so obsessed with race that he'd dedicate himself to ridding the Dominican Republic of its non-whites. But all of that was still way in the future. For now, young Rafael Trujillo would lead the life of any other kid from his area, joining a local gang, making a bit of money through theft and forgery. Yet even as he hung out at the bottom of the social chain, forces were at work that would soon conspire to take this poor, mixed-raced boy to the very, very top. If Haiti was the Dominican Republic's hated sibling, then Uncle Sam was the playground bully who pantsed them both and stole their lunch money. As early as 1905, Washington seized control of the Dominican Customs Agency to pay off debts, effectively holding its finances hostage. But this was only the beginning. In 1915, Woodrow Wilson ordered US Marines to occupy Haiti on the pretext of maintaining order in the Caribbean. At the same time, Washington started making noises about also taking over the Dominican Republic if it couldn't stabilize its politics. Predictably, the threat of US invasion did not stabilize anything. The Dominican government collapsed. On the 7th of May 1916, US forces entered the country. It was the beginning of an 8-year American occupation, one that would completely overturn the established order. It was also the beginning of Rafael Trujillo's rise to absolute power. The thing about embarking on an occupation is that most people don't like their country being occupied. The entire time the Americans ran the Dominican Republic, they had to deal with a guerrilla movement, one they simply didn't have the manpower to overcome. So they began to recruit locals into a new national police force, the Guardia Nacional. Among its members would be Rafael Trujillo. In the years since we last saw him, Trujillo had gotten married, ditched his life of crime, and gotten a legit job working security at a sugar plantation. But this was unglamorous, underpaid work, unbecoming of a man as exceptional as Trujillo thought he was. The new police force then was his ticket out. Commissioned in January 1919, Trujillo wasted no time letting his true colours show. You know how you occasionally meet someone, usually in an office, who has a tiny bit of power and just wields it like they're Julius Caesar? Well, that was Trujillo as a police officer. Before he'd even been in the role 7 months, he was reprimanded for extorting bribes and sexually harassing teenage girls. But rather than being like, maybe we shouldn't promote the creepy sex pest, the GOAT superiors allowed him to keep rising up the ranks. In the heat and noise of the occupation, the Americans didn't care if they were training nice people. He just needed them to be loyal. And Trujillo was a lapdog par excellence for Uncle Sam. In 1924, he'd be promoted to lieutenant colonel. By then, though, his benefactors had enough. By 1924, it was clear that the occupation was the sort of hypocritical failure the US would soon learn to excel at. That July, Washington went, screw this, and handed power to General Horacio Vasquez. As the last American troops ran for the exits, Vasquez turned for support to the only power left in the country, the Guardia Nacional. That was the same Guardia Nacional Rafael Trujillo was slowly taking over. It took 6 years for the GOAT to make his plan. 6 years in which the Guardia Nacional was remade into the Dominican Army and Trujillo promoted to its chief. Finally, in 1930, his moment came. That February, President Vasquez announced he would seek re-election, something the Constitution was super clear that he wasn't supposed to do. In response, the politician Rafael Estrella Ureña whipped up a rebel force which marched on the capital to chase him from power. Before he marched, though, Ureña asked Trujillo to keep the army neutral in the upcoming fight, and Trujillo agreed, but not because he backed Ureña. No. The GOAT had his own plan for the upcoming transfer of power. The moment Vasquez fled, Trujillo sprang into action. With new elections announced for May, Trujillo declared his candidacy, bulling Ureña into running as his VP. That done, he unleashed what would soon become an all-too-familiar wave of terror. Rather than fight fair, Trujillo had his soldiers kidnap, torture, and kill anyone against him. Journalists died in accidents that certainly didn't look very accidental. Crowds of opposition supporters had machine guns fired into their midst. As the tsunami of intimidation threatened to drown their voters, the opposition withdrew, hoping to reveal to the world what a sham the election was. Instead, they handed Trujillo the keys to the kingdom. On election day, Rafael Trujillo pulled down 95% of the vote, taking the presidency in a landslide. Just 4 months later, a hurricane swept the republic, devastating the capital and killing some 2,000 people. It was exactly the stroke of luck Trujillo needed. Under the guise of disaster relief, Trujillo imposed martial law. He confiscated opponents' bank accounts, brought in press censorship, and ended the right to peaceful assembly. Just like that, the era of chaos and occupation in the Dominican Republic came to an end. In its place began an era of bloodshed and unparalleled cruelty. Now, we'll hear more about that bloodshed in just a second, but first, I've got a quick word from today's video sponsor, NordVPN. Now, we've talked about VPNs and their benefits here before. This isn't 1999, too many people are looking for your internet history, bad actors trying to steal your data and your personal information, corporations tracking your browser activity to bombard you with ads, and no one needs any of that. That's why NordVPN is so crucial. It's based over in Panama, which makes it a great option for both Americans and Europeans. And look, a common misconception is that VPNs are just for people who are looking to play defense, but they're not just about protecting yourself. You'll be amazed at the different streaming options you have when jumping on a server from somewhere else in the world. Protect yourself or just play around, buy it for yourself, or consider it as a gift for another internet user in your life. With NordVPN, you've got lots of options, plus a 30-day money-back guarantee if it's not for you. There's never been a better time to enhance your online experience with NordVPN, and that's because right now NordVPN is running a great deal. You guys can grab a 2-year plan at a hugely discounted cost, plus an additional 4 months for free. So head to nordvpn.com/biographics and check it out. That's nordvpn.com/biographics, or just follow the link in the description box below. And now back to the video. The speed with which the Dominican Republic transformed into Trujillo's personal fiefdom was staggering to behold. In the aftermath of the hurricane, political opponents began to disappear or die in accidents and suicides. Before long, anyone who could possibly oppose the new regime was dead in hiding or pretending to be a loyalist. His opposition neutralized, El Jefe was able to give his worst instincts free rein. Today, the dictatorship, or the Trillato as it's locally known, can be said to have three main drivers: centralization, sycophancy, and sadism. Of these, perhaps the key to its survival was centralization. All his professional life, Trujillo had been an extreme micromanager, a skill that he soon brought to bear on the entire country. Almost every pillar of Dominican life was routed through El Jefe's office, from education to religion to entertainment to industry. This allowed Trujillo to force through draconian reforms that whipped the economy into shape, saw the national debt paid off, and the country quickly modernized. Roads unfurled across the landscape, schools and hospitals were built, literacy levels leapt from an abysmal 30% to a staggering 96%. It was these concrete achievements that dazzled his foreign backers in the United States, that led to moments like Democratic Senator Alan J. Ellender declaring, "I wish there were a Trujillo in every country of South and Central America." But while centralization had tangible ups, it also had plenty of downs, the biggest being that Trujillo kept all of the ups for himself. Even as the economy modernized, Trujillo was using state assets to forcibly buy out foreign companies, create monopolies, and hand them over to family members. By his death, it's estimated that something like 3/5 of the nation's workforce was under his control, and up to 60% of its land was in his hands. Manufacturing, sugar plantations, beer production, airlines. If it could spin a profit, it soon became part of the GOAT's empire. In fact, it's this insatiable greed that earned him that nickname in the first place, which brings us on to the regime's second trait: sycophancy. The only people who called Trujillo a goat to his face were probably Cenobites, desperate to experience a fun new kind of torture. Most people used his official title: Benefactor of the Fatherland, Rebuilder of the Financial Independence of the Republic, First Journalist, Chief Protector of the Dominican Working Class, and Genius of the Peace, Generalissimo Dr. Trujillo. It was an absurd mouthful, a word salad dressed with hypocrisy. At the same time, though, it revealed an essential truth. Living under Trujillo meant learning to massage his gigantic ego. That meant casting statues in his likeness across the nation. That meant the government falling over itself to rename streets, parks, mountains, even the capital city after him. It meant neon signs blinking on roadsides, flashing the message Trujillo and God into the humid night air. It meant every household being decorated with a sign reading, "In this house, Trujillo is chief." Yet even amid all this adulation, the goat's vanity still got the better of him. As dictator, Trujillo took to wearing elevator shoes to appear taller than his natural 5'8" inches. In later years, he added a corset to hold in his gut. Not that anyone dared laugh. As you recall, the last pillar of the Trillato was sadism, and it was something El Jefe excelled at. The tortures meted out by the secret police were as inventive as they were painful. Beatings, electroshocks, and mutilation awaited anyone who stepped out of line. There are even long-standing rumors that several dissidents were fed to sharks, but even this had nothing on what could happen if you were young and female. All his life, Rafael Trujillo seems to have had an unhealthy interest in young teenage girls. As an adult, the goat would have girls kidnapped and brought to one of his ranches like Casa Caoba. And once there, well, let's just say Trujillo may have had more in common with Stalin's chief sadist Lavrentiy Beria than we'd like to imagine. As bad as the horrors Trujillo inflicted on his people were, it was the horrors visited upon his neighbors that helped rank him as one of history's great monsters. From a boy who despised his own mixed backgrounds, Rafael Trujillo had grown into a man obsessed with racial purity. In his mind, the Dominican Republic was forever in danger of getting too dark, of losing its European roots and becoming like its hated neighbor Haiti. Back then, the border between the two nations was relatively porous. Haitians crossed for work or love, and many in the region had a mixed parentage. Then, on October 2nd, 1937, the soldiers came. Carrying machetes, they fanned out looking for Haitians or Dominicans with Haitian blood. Supposedly, they asked those with dark skin to pronounce the Spanish word for parsley, Perejil, knowing the Haitians said it differently. And so began the Parsley Massacre, one of the biggest acts of peacetime bloodletting the continent had ever seen. Over a handful of days, somewhere in the region of 17,000 Haitians were hacked to death with machetes, their bodies burned, fed to animals, or just thrown in the sea. In the white heat of the killing, madness took hold. One lieutenant who heard of the massacre and wanted to impress Trujillo promptly marched home and shot his Haitian cook. Yet, despite the genocidal nature of the killings, the goat suffered almost no consequences. Sure, he had to relinquish the presidency to a puppet, but he remained the one pulling the strings. Sure, the US forced him to pay compensation to Haiti, but it amounted to a mere $525,000, a pittance for every person killed. Nor did the regime put a halt to its whitening policies. For observers at the time, the flinging open of the Dominican Republic's doors to refugees from the Spanish Civil War and Jews escaping Nazi persecution was puzzling, especially as Trujillo was cozy with Europe's fascists. But it was simply the soft flip side to the Parsley Massacre. Trujillo wanted to drive black people out of his nation while also inviting whites in. The despot's hope was that European refugees would intermarry with Dominicans, thereby purifying his nation's race. Flagrantly insane as all this is, though, you wouldn't know it from looking at how the international community reacted. In the post-war era, the US embraced him fully, trumpeting El Jefe's reforms and anti-communism. He met with Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, then Vice President Richard Nixon was photographed clasping his hand and grinning. In Europe, Catholic governments lined up to celebrate his economic achievements. The Vatican showered him with awards. But even as he was playing the golden boy on the world stage, Trujillo was still up to his nasty old tricks. Out in the Dominican countryside, peasants were being used as forced labor on sugar plantations owned by the regime. At the same time, the secret police was extending its reach, assassinating critics across the world. Most famously, this included PhD student Jesús Galíndez, who was writing a book on Trujillo's dark side. In 1956, he was kidnapped off the streets of New York and flown to one of Trujillo's private ranches, where it's said that the goat forced him to eat his own manuscript before, in turn, feeding his body to the pigs. Eternal as El Jefe and his despotic regime may have appeared, though, it would soon turn out to be an illusion. Beneath the surface of Dominican society, volcano was starting to rumble, a volcano of anger pent up from decades of living beneath a capricious tyrant. When it finally erupted, there would be nothing the benefactor of the fatherland could do to stop his regime from going up with it. As the 1950s drew to a close, Trujillo was once again reinventing his nation, this time as a haven for other despots. Colombian strongman Gustavo Pinilla sought refuge there after being deposed, followed by Venezuelan tyrant Perez Jimenez. But it was the dictator who arrived on January 1st, 1959, who changed everything. Fulgencio Batista had ruled Cuba with brutality easily equal to Rafael Trujillo's. Yet, he had been overthrown by a bunch of communist rebels. For everyone in the Caribbean, the Cuban Revolution acted as a wake-up call. Realizing he might be vulnerable to a similar ousting, El Jefe even signed a mutual assistance pact with his great enemy Haiti. Yet, Trujillo wasn't the only one obsessed with Castro's surprise victory. Within a month of Batista being overthrown, the Dominican Liberation Movement had formed. That June 1959, they sent an expeditionary force to overthrow the goat. Although Trujillo's forces crushed them, it still took a psychological toll. In the wake of the coup attempt, El Jefe began to get dangerously paranoid. It didn't help that the wider world was finally waking up to his excesses. With his term almost over, President Eisenhower was pressuring Trujillo to step down. At the same time, the Organization of American States, OAS, was following the lead of Venezuela's President Romulo Betancourt in demanding the Dominican Republic return to democracy. Shaken, mistrustful, Trujillo responded the only way he knew how. On June 24th, 1960, the presidential car was driving Betancourt down one of the main avenues in Caracas when it was hit by the mother of all explosions. 65 kilos of TNT detonators as it passed, shattering the vehicle and killing 2 people. Somehow, President Betancourt survived. The next day, he went on TV and told the world who was behind the attack: Rafael Trujillo. It was the beginning of the end of the dictatorship. Although El Jefe tried to claim the bombing was carried out by rogue members of the security forces, no one bought it. The Dominican Republic was isolated internationally. It couldn't have come at a worse time. Just as the OAS and Trujillo's old US backers cut ties, the Republic was lurching into an economic crisis. Desperate for cash to prop up his regime, Trujillo pivoted to Moscow, abandoning his long-held anti-communist beliefs. When that didn't work, he tried to find new scapegoats at home, accusing Roman Catholic priests of a vast conspiracy against him. He even considered assassinating the Pope. As he flailed on the world stage, though, El Jefe still had absolute power at home. Even in this worsening economic crisis and climate of paranoia, no one dared move against him. By now, Trujillo's rule was so absolute that he thought he was invincible, that his people were so cowed he could get away with anything. was about to find out just how wrong that assumption was. Minerva Mirabal was one of 3 Dominican sisters who acted as a professional thorn in the dictator's side. Back in 1949, Trujillo had tried to coerce her into having sex with him, holding her father hostage and threatening her family. But Mirabal had stared him down, and in the end, the goat had blinked first. Ever since, the two had hated each other with a passion, a hatred that only grew as Minerva and her 2 sisters began plotting against the regime under the name Las Mariposas, or the Butterflies. In the late 1960s, Trujillo finally decided that it had enough. That November the 25th, the Butterflies were stopped in their car by the regime's thugs. Abducted at gunpoint, they were savagely beaten, their bodies then loaded back into the car and rolled into the sea. It was a typical murder for Trujillo's goons, the sort of thing that happens on a near-daily basis. This time, though, it hit a nerve. The Mirabal sisters were young, beautiful, popular on the capital's social scene. Their horrific, violent deaths touched people in a way that the deaths of countless others never had. In the shattered, broken bodies of the Butterflies, it seems those who'd previously been too scared or too loyal at last saw their leader's true colors. El Jefe didn't know it yet, but from that moment on, his days were numbered. On May the 30th, 1961, a car full of men sat idling by the road leading to San Cristobal, waiting for their prey. It was late evening, a typical lush Dominican night. Further up the road, 3 more men lurked in the darkness, guns loaded and ready. Finally, they saw it. En route from the capital, the chauffeur-driven Chevrolet taking the old goat to one of his dalliances with the younger women. As the car drew closer, the men readied their guns, knowing this was their only chance. The Chevrolet pulled level, and the night exploded in gunfire. The shootout that ended the Triato was the result of a whole lot of people becoming a whole lot of pissed off at their leader's increasing madness. The military was involved, the opposition, even the CIA helped supply weapons. With that sort of backing, how could it possibly go wrong? Rafael Trujillo's life ended that night, his bloodied form left sprawled across the road. Aged 69, he lost power as violently as he gained it. It was a triumphal moment, one still celebrated in the Dominican Republic today. It was also far from the end of the nightmare. With his father dead, El Jefe's son, Ramfis, returned to the country and installed himself as the new boss. Over the next few days, nearly all the conspirators and their extended families were murdered. Yet Ramfis just didn't have the goat's touch. Before the year was out, he and his entire Trujillo family would have fled into exile, taking their plundered loot with them. In their place arose a reformist government headed by Juan Bosch, one that briefly looked as if it might steer the country towards democracy. But then the military toppled him in a coup, and when his supporters took up arms, Uncle Sam stepped right back in with another occupation. Under the Americans, new elections were held in 1966, returning old Trujillo loyalist Joaquin Balaguer as president. A guy who'd clearly learned from his old boss, Balaguer would spend the next 12 years rigging elections, murdering opponents, and having over 10,000 people tortured. Voted out in 1978, he returned for an encore 8 years later, only finally stepping down for good in 1996. Trujillo may have been long dead by then, but his influence on Balaguer was impossible to miss. Today, the cost of the Triato remains unknown, although it's likely very high. One estimate we saw put the number of political murders from the period of 1916 to 1978, covering the first US occupation, the Trujillo years, and Balaguer's first stint as president, at north of 50,000. That's a staggering figure in such a small country, one which, at the moment of Trujillo's death, had a population of just 3.5 million. Yet the true toll of El Jefe's reign might be even higher. As one of the first modern tyrants in the Americas, Rafael Trujillo wrote the playbook that countless others would follow. Monsters like Augusto Pinochet, Jorge Videla, and the generals in Brazil would all engage in Trujillo-esque levels of depravity while simultaneously casting themselves as fervent anti-communists to placate Washington. After all, they already knew such tactics worked. For all his overt violence, his sadism, his sexual perversions, Rafael Trujillo managed to create a world where presidents and politicians fell over themselves to praise him. At his height, he had been a darling of Washington, a superstar in Europe, a devil everyone was only too eager to pretend was really a saint. He may be long dead, but the life of El Jefe is still capable of teaching us a lesson, of showing us what nightmares can be born when our leaders willingly turn a blind eye to the actions of a monster. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.